We start, George.
Okay. Good afternoon. We welcome you all most warmly to this first panel that belongs to the third Students' Colloquium of the Master's Degree in Science of Architecture and Urbanism, in which we have with us Maritina Iliadi from Edinburgh, University, Scotland. Welcome.
Hello.
We also have Carlos Londoño from Universidad Pontificia Bolivariana, Colombia. Welcome, Carlos.
Hi, everyone.
Finally, we have Alejandra Calva Ábalos and Ireri Niño Martinez from CEPI, Esia, Tecamachalco, IPN, Mexico. Welcome.
Hi, everybody.
This will be the sequence in which the presentations will be rendered. We want to thank you in advance. We want to remind that those who have asked for a diploma should write your name and email at the general chat. We also want you to remember that every question or comment will be delivered via the same general chat, writing the name of the panelist to whom it is addressed, so as to avoid distractions. In case of a technical failure during the broadcasting, please access the session again with the very same link, and also using Facebook to monitor any announcement regarding this aspect. Finally, at the end of the session, a photograph of the group will be taken. In that moment, we will need your webcams on. Having said that, let's start with our panel. Maritina Iliadi is our first panelist. She's an architect with almost 10 years of experience. She has worked in Greece, the USA, and the UK in small to large multicultural and highly diverse workplaces. She has been involved in design of projects of different sectors and varying complexity and scale. And she has worked as a volunteer offering pro bono design services to low-income communities. Currently, she's a student at the Master's in Science of Urban Strategies and Design program at the University of Edinburgh. And she will talk about housing and social integration strategies of asylum seekers in Athens, the role of grassroots organizations. Please proceed, Maritina.
Thank you, George. Thank you for the introduction. Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you for the invitation to participate in this colloquium. This is a very context-heavy presentation that I have, so I would like to start immediately, like right away, and try to keep it on time. My dissertation examines the issue of housing and social spatial integration of asylum seekers in Greece, with a particular focus in Athens and the role of grassroots initiatives. This is a very sensitive subject for the whole European Union and my home country, due to the sensitive geographical location of Greece has been in the center of the European refugee crisis, which started in 2014, peaked in 2015, and still goes on today at a lower but steady rate, as you will see the numbers of arrival down at the left. During this time, Greece has been the entry point for about 1 million immigrants who entered the country illegally, with a goal to cross it and reach Northern European countries like Germany. Most of the arrivals happen by sea, at the border between the Turkish coast and the Eastern Aegean Sea. I don't know if you can see my cursor. The highly centralized governance system in Greece requires that most immigrants that enter these points go through Athens during their asylum process. Two very heavy political events, the closure of the Balkan route and the EU-Turkey agreement in 2016, trapped these immigrants that were seeking asylum in other European countries in Greece, where they were forced to apply for asylum there. And then the question of more permanent housing solutions in Greece was raised. Before going further, okay. Before going further, it would be important to first explain that an asylum seeker versus a refugee is a person who seeks protection in a foreign country due to threats for his personal safety in his home country. During the waiting period for the asylum application, the host country is responsible to provide housing, financial assistance, and social services to asylum seekers. Once asylum is granted and the person is considered a refugee, and he or she loses these benefits, and then they have responsibilities and freedoms as a regular citizen. According to the UN Refugee Agency, by the end of 2018, about 140,000 refugees and asylum seekers were stranded in Greece. Just for a reference, Greece is a 10 million country, 10 million people country, so this is a pretty high number. To put it simply, Greece has never had a social housing policy or immigrant reception and integration policy. So any form of housing and integration had to be reinvented because everything by that time was on the basis of emergency. Therefore, they started trying to build all these things together. And when OECD tried to map out the situation, it looked like this very complicated diagram of multiple actors who acted parallel in different locality levels. Out of this complex top-down system, two basic types of formal housing arise. One is the reception facilities, also known as refugee camps, and the other one is the stay accommodation scheme. Sorry. In both options, people are placed based on vulnerability criteria and the availability of space. Otherwise, asylum seekers are supposed to find their own accommodation, which most times leads to homelessness due to discrimination, exploitation, and lack of financial resources. In general, there are several refugee camps across Greece that serve different functions, either as official accommodation or hotspots, as they call the reception and identification centers close to the borders. The hotspots are supposed to be temporary, but with the large number of applications combined with the slow processing and the non-stop inflows and the lack of sufficient housing, it results in overcrowded facilities like wrong slide, like the infamous Moria in the Lesbos island, the shame of Europe as they call it. But in the mainland, the camps in the mainland, and specifically in the outskirts of Athens, in the outskirts of Athens, there are 5 camps made for longer stays, and people are housed in containers. And usually these places are located in old industrial or old military bases, with usually poor connection to the city center. The media and human rights organizations have criticized the living conditions in the refugee camps. Overcrowded camps have become places of precarious living conditions, violating basic human rights, which with the current threat of the pandemic has only gotten worse. The inhabitants suffer the isolation and stigmatization from the local communities, which makes them easy targets for racist attacks, and vulnerable population of women and girls are in constant risk of assault. On the other hand, the stay accommodation scheme offers longer stays for asylum seekers in scattered apartments in urban areas while giving access to social services run mainly by NGOs. And almost 50% of this type of accommodation exists in Athens. Even though it is considered a far better alternative to the refugee camps, it still suffers from absence of long-term planning and a holistic approach to the social integration. The biggest part of the workload falls on NGOs who are not paid enough or lack experience of dealing with asylum seekers. And again, more people here coming in the program than leaving the program, which cause overcrowdedness and long waiting lists for people who are in refugee camps waiting to get into the apartment program. In the meantime, while the government tries to build the housing, a huge solidarity movement was emerged in across Europe and Greece against these precarious living conditions in the formal housing and the increased homelessness of immigrants who were living in public squares and parks around Athens. Um, uh, so in Athens, the solidarity movement found, sorry, uh, the sliding is, the slides go a little crazy. In Athens, the solidarity movement found legal or illegal ways to develop its own housing initiatives to accommodate asylum seekers. Especially this was expressed by occupying empty abandoned buildings that have been empty since the financial crisis of 2010, which led to the collapse of the housing market in Athens and still goes on today. And by 2019, in the anarchist neighborhood of Exarchia, in the center of Athens, there were multiple occupied buildings, or squats as they're called, out of which more than 15 were specifically refugee housing squats. One of the most famous squats is that of City Plaza Hotel, along with a couple very well self-organized spaces in Exarchia. These refugee squads provided housing to any kind of immigrant, regardless of the status, complemented by medical services, schooling for children, foreign language lessons, soup kitchens, and other activities. They function without funding, only with donations, and under strict rules of behavior against violence or illegal substance abuse. In the summer of 2019, though, the current government ordered the eviction of these squads and led the asylum seekers back in homelessness or overcrowded camps. Another form of legal housing that the solidarity movement produced was small grassroots NGOs that offered housing in small capacity to specific groups like single women or mothers of young, or single women or mothers and young men, along with a similar range of social services to the squads. When asked, asylum refugees who lived in these self-organized communities had very different and positive opinions in comparison to those living in camps. So the question that is raised is whether these grassroots initiatives were more successful than the EU or the Greek state strategies. And if yes, whether their approach could be formalized and used to serve the rising numbers of asylum seekers. The hypothesis of my dissertation starts by questioning the quality of the formal strategies for housing and social integration that are in place by the state, and they are examined with the alternative existing strategies of the solidarity movement. Um, so my approach starts with the theory of the right to the city and the right to adequate housing, analyzes the context of migrant reception and housing policies, along with the urban analysis and housing conditions in Athens. Then I conduct a comparative analysis between the case studies that I mentioned previously, and I end up with lessons learned and conclusions. Finally, regarding my research methods, apart from the literature, the extended literature review and secondary data analysis, I was planning to visit Athens to conduct site visits in place and meet and interview people involved in both the formal and informal initiatives. But these plans totally failed due to the travel restrictions with COVID. And after that, it was really hard for me to approach those people and convince them to trust me for an online interview. Regardless, I'm currently finished my research and I'm in the process of writing the dissertation and submit it in less than a month. So yeah, this is it. Thank you very much. Any questions?
No, thank you, Maritina. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. Mexico is now living a crisis with Central American migrants who will probably
Yeah,
end up living in this country. We'd better take your research into consideration. Thank you. Now, we will introduce the next presentation with Carlos Londoño, who is a bachelor in education with emphasis in foreign languages. He sees himself as an educator in language with a humanist approach to the learning teaching process, well aware of the academical rigor, passionate with the educational policies and the social management of national and international level. He is also engaged with topics such as learning assessment, cognitive development, and the pedagogical processes used in the implementation of mega projects of development. He is a team worker with his students, his peers, and his superiors. He will present three triads of Ayacucho Street, Medellin, 1990-2020, about the production and reproduction of the space from its agents and interest between daily life and the commodification of life. Please, Carlos, proceed.
Thank you, Jorge. And hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. As Jorge tell you, my project research is called The Three Triads of Ayacucho Street, Medellin, 2020, in 1990 to 2020, about the production and reproduction of the space from its agents and between daily life and the commodification of life. First of all, I want to explain you the idea of the three triads. The best way to understand the three triads is like a triangle, which is made up of three sides, and each vertex can create another triangle. So the three triads are, number one, the three agents that produce the state, real estate, financial capital, social groups, and the state, as you can see it. The second triad is the three spaces proposed by Lefebvre in his theory of the production of the space: conceive space, perceive space, and live space. And the third triad is the section of Ayacucho Street. So where is Ayacucho and where is it located? In the north of South America, we can find Colombia. Inside of it, we can find the department of Antioquia and its capital, Medellin, the second most important city in the country. Medellin is divided in 14 communes, and Ayacucho cross the communes 8, 9, and 10 in the east of the city. This is one, excuse me, Ayacucho has a historical importance in the constitution of the city. That is why there can be a classification of the project. But also because nowadays this street is under pressure for different agents, as mentioned previously, who are producing this space as a space that is difficult to follow. So the phenomenon is not a new thing in Medellin. Actually, since 1990s, government has been looking for strategies to overcome the drug problems and change the images of the city, because in the 1991, Medellin was recognized as the most violent city on the world, and also has been linked as the Pablo Escobar city. So based on the previous experience from cities like Sao Paulo and Barcelona, the administration adopted a model based on urbanism that it called social urbanism, despite the fact, as you can see, despite the fact that the administration have gained a lot of awards, there are many problems in the city that we can solve the social urbanism. What kind of problems? Problems like inequality, poverty, informal work, habitat destruction, and housing deficit. Another important problem is the gentrification in places like Ayacucho. A previous story showed that how important was to get a public protection policy for residents. Nowadays, we have a policies for the residents, but when administration made the most important projects in the city, we don't have this policy. So based on this problem, I designed the following research question. How was the production or reproduction of Ayacucho Street as a space in the city of Medellin had been produced in the period of 1990 to 2020 from its agents and interests, considering its transformation for axis of daily life to an axis of the commodification of life. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah, go on, Carlos, please.
Okay, to answer this question, I designed three objectives and the methodology to achieve that. Methodology was supported by critical geography related by dialectical historical materialism and using the specific method provided by Lefebvre progressive regressive method. The primary information was collected throughout interviews with agents, and the secondary information was collected throughout thesis, paper, newspaper, open data, and also reviewing the different plans created for the municipality. Finally, graphic indicators were created on maps to show the contradiction between the agents and its interests in the production of the space. For the conceptual framework, I take into account three different authors like Jorge Lobato Correa, who talk about the different agents in the production of the space, David Harvey, who highlight the contradiction in capitalism system, Henry Lefebvre, who help us to understand the three different spaces and the implication of urbanism in everyday life, and finally Milton Santos, who provided different concepts, especially the social space, but also help us to understand the role of the capital in the production of the space. As I've told you before, three objectives were designed to answer the research question. The first one was to describe the historical constitution of Ayacucho, articulating axis of the city, recognizing the physical, social, economical, and political structuring matrices. It implied to recognize the spatial process concept. It means reviewing the past to find out how this street was constituted and the role of the agent and how the activities allocate and how the activities were located and relocated in the space throughout these years. It allowed me to find how the private capital was fundamental in the constitution of this street and the ideal of progress that guided the construction of the main architecture works. The second objective was to characterize the agents and interests that intervene in the production of the street Ayacucho from the city of Medellin. The first agent I was taking into account was the state and its different institutions. After reviewing the plans and information in Ayacucho, I found that many of the construction in terms of mobility and public space are related with creation of conditions for investment in private sector, and also intervention were designed to attract tourists. On the other hand, the issue of public investment in low-income housing was a structural problem due to the peripheral location and low cost of these homes. This is the case of Ciudadela del Este. This is an urbanization of the section 3 of Ayacucho. And you can find some intervention of the state here, especially in the section 2 of Ayacucho. But also in terms of competitiveness, we can find how the territorial ordering have evolved, passing from city to city region and super city. Now the state want to connect the city of Medellin with another regions in Medellin, and most important for our research work is the east of the region, because Ayacucho must be connected with the eastern tunnel, as you can see here, which is the most longest tunnel in Latin America. The second agent is the real estate financial capital. The thesis analyzed the importance of the sector in the foreign investment in the city and shows how the three shopping centers were built in less than a kilometer in less than 5 years. For the tier agent, based on the socio-spatial practice, I take into account in consideration three different social groups: traditional inhabitants, new inhabitants, and tourists. And the objective three was to reveal the contradiction between agents and their interests in the process of production and reproduction of space in Ayacucho between daily life and commodification of life. The most important findings are how the process of attracting investors and tourists in the lifespan produce a change of life on landscape. It implies the destruction of many traditional buildings in order to show a modern images of the city and also to allow the real estate financial capital to develop their intervention. To develop this objective, we find we use the term between. So we find a contradiction between new and old, foreign and local, legal and illegal, formal and informal. But the most important contradiction for us was also to reveal that the vacancy of level of some buildings built by the sector, the private sector, and at the same time the housing deficit in the city. I mean, many buildings that can be sold or rent versus a greater number of homeless people. Okay, now I want to share quickly some opportunities and challenges that I handle in the research process, considering that we are living in a complicated time of pandemic. So the opportunities, first of all, was the fact of nowadays we can find a lot of information on internet, even the contact of many public workers for interview, and also we can find the plan of municipalities, papers, and so on. Also, we can find a lot of interviews in YouTube, which reveal a lot of clues to follow the execution of the plans and what is coming next for the city. Finally, thanks to the open data, we can find current and reliable information to construct the graphics that we need to the indicators at the last objective. And in the other hand, the challenges in the process, where many of the traditional inhabitants were all people who are afraid of technology. So they prefer to schedule an interview personally. Also, work around the street was difficult due to the restriction that government imposed. And the last challenge was the pandemic itself, because it was a milestone and an external contradiction that their behavior predicted some years ago. So I had to dedicate a special part to describe the phenomenon and the street. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carlos. Um, Thank you for your participation. Interesting to see how a philosopher's vision, who, by the way, was very influential in the late 60s and 70s, can shed light on such urban processes. Thank you. Now, we will hand the microphone to Alejandra Calva Avalos and Ireri Niño Martinez, both engineer architects and currently students of the workshop City and Culture in the Master in Science of Architecture and Urbanism at CEPI, Esia Tecamachalco, IPN, Mexico. They will present urban perspectives and new sociocultural challenges in Porto, reflections on urban policies and their effects. And we start with Alejandra. Please, Alejandra, proceed.
Okay. Um, um, Hello, everybody. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Alejandra Calva, and the message I would like to share with you, first of all, is the importance of regarding to be flexible when researching. As a result of this comes this research called Urban Perspectives and New Social Cultural Challenge in Porto, Reflections on Urban Policies and Their Effects. This will be divided in two parts. The first part, I will explain it, and the second part, my partner Ireri will. Okay. Okay. But first, please allow me to introduce myself. Well, I decided to become an engineer architect, and however, with the time, I realized that I didn't become an architect to build and design buildings. So I found that I could be an architect that can be able to design and build opportunities. Also, that I was able to study cultural phenomena on a micro scale. I understood that the biggest builder is the people, and my passion was there to be able to discover and expose the needs of the people, can be with the urbanization planning. In short, my partner and I, we study the relationship between the city and the culture. Well, in March, Irene and I traveled to Porto, Portugal, with hopes of finding new research methodologies and new cultural practices to know absolutely everything we could know about different country from our own. Our main goal was to find more tools that could allow us to know more about doing research on urban and social phenomenon. But we didn't have in mind one factor, the reality factor, the COVID-19 pandemic and its many challenges. Among the least tragic ones, however important for the research, is to be unable to go out to the field and to do research. Then we ask ourselves, what should we do and how? And normally we practice research on qualitative type in a micro scale. I mean, with this is to we follow a procedure to apply to the analysis of the urban phenomenon in a small and a close and a deep one. So, okay, so it was that moment that we had to be flexible and strengthen the research in the analysis of the historical, social, cultural, politic, and economic framework. This led us to perform an analysis of the microscale. I had told you all this so you could be in context of the next research. Okay, we decide to make a research which proposes a reflection on the urbanization process regarding its social cultural complexity, starting from the historical analysis along with the study of public housing policies and their effects. Uh, One of, well, we have many goals, but the main objective is to build a contextual framework that explains the current city of Porto based on the analysis of the political and social events that Portugal had, and to propose different European perspectives so that through this analysis model, the current changes are understood. Uh, Also, followed by explaining the new social cultural challenge in Porto that coexist in urban and architecture identities. Finally, to know the importance of public housing policies and their effects on the social urban network. Okay. In addition, in the last decades, the urbanization process in Porto had took place in all the country. So this is a global perspective and has produced living conditions that complicate and violent the daily life of inhabitants of Porto. And what causes this? Well, the most important is the world economic crisis in 2008, also strategies to recover the economy, better known as financial bailouts, and at the same time, the real estate pressure and the strong real estate market. Together with a permanent progressive narrative, they gave rise to the privatization of rural territories, and with this, to display social cultural forms. Okay. Ah, I'm sorry. Okay, there is. The effects are arising from the conditioning and are many. It's going crazy. Sorry, it's too slow, I think. sorry, these slides are getting too fast. Okay. The effects arising from this condition, oh my God. Sorry. It's like, no. Okay. This is, stay there, please. Okay. The effects arising from this condition are many. Among the most relevant are social, oh no, I don't know what's happening. Well, I'm going to stay there and I'm going to explain the effects and in this history, but continue with the effects. The social spatial inclusion and the creation of vulnerability container groups. By this, um, I mean housing complexes located in outskirts, in addition to specific morphological changes that always benefit tourism. At the same time, territories fragmented and discontinued from a whole. This set of vulnerabilities are mostly addressed by public policies or for urban rehabilitation and the social network. These government and private strategies in the center of Porto were launched by the City Council circa 2004 with the intention of attract new residents, investment, business, development, and promotion. This renewal of trade and also dynamism of tourism, culture, and leisure. This is how I say a global urban perspective of Porto, and however, there are also public houses, public houses, policies, which Ireri will explain later. And in this slide, a little bit of history. And the question is, but what happened? What caused, what happened in the past that conditioned these effects? Well, during the 19th century, thanks to the industrialization and large number of incoming population, were attracted, forcing them to densify, expand, and seek shelter. And the housing shortage was quite a lot, specifically for the working class. And the solution to this problem was absorbed by the private initiative. And clear example of this is that was the construction of illas, which are modest housing complexes with precarious living condition. Followed by the decades from 30s to 70s, it was the construction of public houses that gave rise to a massive densification. New social housing developments emerged out of proportion throughout Portugal, mostly located in peri-urban areas. Next, in the revolutionary process and the 18-month period of restructuration, the state activities such as rehabilitation of the great historical centers and inclusive housing programs were launched. With this, spatial and social integration presented a challenge, and some neighborhoods became stigmatized and socially critical areas with it, creating groups where the concentration of vulnerabilities could increase problems. And if I have time, and passing to the conclusions, I don't know why you can skip. Oh, why? Okay. The conclusions. Up to this point, oh my, no. The next. Okay. It's too slow. Okay, up to this point, we can conclude in two perspectives that happen together. The first one has to do with the replacement of the residents, although the politics do not completely solve the social problems. It seems that it only creates a dynamic for them to change their place to live in, to give way to the new residents and give a place to new economic practices. But at the same time, the modern city is historical elements such as Porto is innovating from tourism and services, living in its public spaces, the production of the city and social integration, and with this new social cultural practices. Finally, I'm sorry that this slides, okay. Finally, oh my God. finally, uh, well, if you remember at the beginning, I told you about the importance of being flexible. Well, that Portugal led us. It's a lesson that has to be with the ability to react scientific research under the condition of not being able to go out and at the field. The fact is that daring to carry out research on another scale with another instrument in another country makes you flexible. And if you don't take it up, well, you will otherwise lose the mention as research. And finally, once we came out to know a pieces of Portugal, it was incredible because we watched with a naked eye, and it was impressive. Okay, in the next part with my partner Lily, you will see very important elements that consolidate better this picture. Thank you.
Please, Ireri, start. Thank you.
Well, hi everyone. Good morning. My name is Mary Niño, and I'm going to talk to you about housing exclusion, territories, and new social policies in Portugal. This is a short analysis about these topics. Okay. Due to cyclical population movements, their causes, and the way territory was distributed and occupied, we could assume that having access to housing is a reflection of an economic, social, and ethnic condition that at the same time is a social exclusion factor, determining the future opportunities of people. Based on the fact that housing problems are related to population movements as a result of the recent immigration phenomenon. Okay. Housing problems are associated to other types of deprivation and a context of poverty that tends to reproduce and identify itself with territories that become synonymous to exclusion. This situation has influenced a new generation of housing policies in Portugal. The need to act on the origin of these problems by approaching people leads to a rethinking of the role of the different institutional levels and associations that work with society. In Porto, the biggest demographic movement took place at the end of the 19th century, doubling its population due to the industrialization process and the displacement of the rural population towards the city. These people were concentrated especially in the medieval part of the city, next to the river, causing a strong densification of the population and a division of the living spaces. At the same time, was spread throughout the city the largest human dimension worker accommodation that it's called the Ilas that Alejandra told you before. These are long corridors of access to small single-story houses developed behind middle-class houses, mainly on the city center. These houses generally don't go beyond small rooms with common exterior services. This form of accommodation proliferated until the first decades of the 20th century, triggering levels of unhealthiness in the last decade of 19th century, 30% of the population live in these ilas. And now it's estimated that there are still some ilas where about 15,000 people live there. That represents the 5% of the Porto population nowadays. In the 20th century, with the support of hygienist theories, in order to prevent the proliferation of these structures and regulate housing, first housing policies appeared, both public and private. Here began the process of displacement of low economic resources population towards the peripheries of the city. This changed the logic of growth and the development of the city. The creation of these areas, often discontinuous in relation to the urban city, has a strong presence of low economic resources groups that generated marginal territories with lack of economic and social integration. We can see here an image of the ilas, how they look like. Now about at the national level in Portugal around the 70s, clandestine construction still predominated. It will not be until the 90s that housing production improves as a result of the extension of credit banks, the liberalization of the rent, lower interest rates, and job growth. The municipalities have been making some attempts to calm the situation, for example, with self-construction, urbanizing lands assigned to neighborhood associations. The longest term policy has been give credit to property housing, and this has become Portugal one of the European countries with a high rate of property ownership. But on the other hand, the family effort to pay the mortgage fee on the house was increased a lot. Until the 90s, housing rehabilitation, mainly in the city center, is still low. Also, it was expected that increases in order to reinforcement of housing policies and improvement of existing programs back then. And now about the housing and territorial policies to fight the poverty. Let's talk about some programs. Well, in 1989, for the first time, the question of territory acquires a key importance, and the concept of exclusion comes to have a meaning in relation to a new concept of poverty. This new poverty is characterized by disaffiliation and crisis in the primary relationships between the society and their environment. Most of the poverty territories were mainly in social neighborhoods, depressed and depopulated rural settings, and fishing areas in coming decline due to a loss of activity. Several programs have been developed with an approach methodology from a territory where different programs were intersected. Well, we can appreciate mainly two phases of the historical housing policies in Porto. First, we have the new housing constructions that include some attempts to regulate housing problems like the construction of economic houses, detachable houses, and totally new neighborhoods of social interest located in the periphery of the city. Here we can see some houses from Lordelo do Ouro neighborhood. This is one of the first neighborhoods that were built with a social interest housing approach. The second stage from the 90s was the rehabilitation of the built space. Here we have some institutions like the CRUAF, that is the Commissioners of Urban Recovery of the Rivera and Barredo area, who made some interventions mainly in the city center. Also, it was made some improvement plans for the city, and most recently, a public program of rehabilitation of Porto, where economic resources are obtained through taxes generated by the tourism of the city. Here in this image, we can see an intervention of some buildings at the city center into the Porto Vivo program in 2017. Well, as a conclusion, we have until the 90s, the social housing policies implemented were characterized by the construction of new housings on the outskirts of the city. At the beginning of the new millennium, they focused on the rehabilitation of building. However, none of these developed policies have been proven to be capable enough to solve existing housing problems. And well, this is it. We are really glad that you are here with us today and hope this analysis could be useful for future researchers. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Iredi. Thank you, Alejandra. Very interesting to see how public and private spaces are being transformed and even distorted by, among other causes, the gentrification. Now, we have carefully listened to our four presenters and their interesting topics. Let's open the questions and answer section. A question will be read to each panelist in the same order they made their presentations. First question to, first question to Maritina. Housing is a cultural production. Every culture perceives housing as a result of the way they conceive their reality. Trying to provide housing from our Occidental vision is not a problem. According to your research, don't you think we have to know and respect um, how they conceive housing in order to provide a better quality life or housing? Thank you.
Yeah. Um, yeah, absolutely. Cultural production of housing is very important, but in this specific case, it is overthrown by the commodification of housing and the fact that Athens is suffering. Actually, Athens used to have a this cultural aspect of housing. People were like the most popular production of housing was self-built. People were building or taking loans and they were building their own housing. And that was very popular because there was no welfare policy on housing from on regard of the state to provide social housing for those who didn't have the means to build their own. So squatting of land and illegal build of housing became very popular, and the authorities kind of turned a blind eye to that. But after the latest financial crisis, this type of self-built production was deeply like it was just interrupted completely, and people were not only able to build their houses, they weren't able to repay the loans for the houses that they have already built. So it kind of maybe right now it's kind of a luxury to consider the cultural factor when we don't even have housing for those in need, like to cover immediate needs of housing for those who don't have the means to build their own. So, what I examine in the first place is how you can provide housing to those people who need it immediately in order to to start their lives somewhere, and then they can go on from there and build their new lives wherever that is going to be. We're starting from very, very bottom.
Thank you, Maritina. Now we have a question for Carlos. Carlos, uh, the development discourse allows interventions that produce and reproduce urban spaces. The question is whether in your research you have found that these interventions really help local inhabitants to improve their lives, or on the contrary, it is the first step to normalize the expulsions of these inhabitants by others, something like gentrification.
Okay, what we find in the research process is that the intervention of the state and the private as urbanism in the urbanism of the city have facilitated or create the conditions for the another capitals to come, aim for tourists, but not for locals inhabitants. That's their answer.
Mhm. Thank
So,
you.
discourse of the development here in Medellin, the social urbanism has not some answers for as a real development. So have failed completely with this purpose.
Thank you, Carlos. Now, question for, I take it for Ireri and Ali. Uh, it says, do you believe that actual housing policies are improving the quality of life of Porto's inhabitants, and why?
I can answer. What I could observe current now, the urban policies, is that there is an institution called Domo Social, which was created in the 70s with the purpose of regulate the issues of housing for the low-income population mostly. And mainly they are in charge of assigning houses to families that prove that have low income resources. And this domus social give them a very low rental fee. And to make this possible, government assigned them some money that comes mainly by a tax that comes from the tourism of the city, and this tourism has grown exponentially in the last 10 years. Thanks to a program focused on cultural and recreation activities called Porto Vivo. And this causes a good housing offer of low-income families, and at the same time it keeps the city economic active, which is sustained mostly by the tourism in Porto, and this creates overall quality in general, no? for the city. And yes.
Thank you, Daddy. Ale, I have another question for you. Can you tell us how important is the relation between the users and the rehabilitation of the degraded historical center?
The importance of the relationship, it's, I think, the most important thing that the government should pay attention, because the main problem is that to avoid exclusion, it breaks the relationship and the framework, social and historical and cultural. So I think that in order to integrate and to not replace it geographically, these groups of persons would be better in many ways, and in somehow the historical buildings will be living together with the social practices.
Well, thank you, Alejandra. Thank you very much. Now, the time is up. Unfortunately, we don't have much more time left. I would like to think that panelists have had the chance to read some of your other questions, and I'll ask them to give us their answers in such a way we can add them to the final document of the colloquium. If you could get these questions, please, you will later on give us the answers so as to give answers to those questions. Thank you. Now, we want to thank you for your participation, all the attendees, for listening, and the interest and reflections of our panelists. It is important to say that this exchange of information between the speakers and the audience contributes to the diffusion of the knowledge and is part of the important feedback that opens new panoramas for both researchers and the future of our nations. We thank our panelists for their enthusiastic participation, and we urge you to take advantage of this event to generate research links to go between our institutions to build a better world. Before closing the session, I would like to ask the panelists, as well as the attendees, if you may, to activate your webcams in such a way we can take a photograph of the event and its participants as a way of looking for new integration dynamics. Okay, we're waiting for the attendees. Some are not yet with their webcam on.
Excuse me.
Let's wait for a minute. Yes, Alejandra.
In whether all connected, I want to thank you all, the team of the colloquium, for all the opportunities. Thank you.
Okay, staff, you tell me when you're ready for the photograph, please. Done? Well, ready. Thank you very much. These images will be posted in our social networks. Please do not forget to follow us so that you can appreciate the materials we generate along this week. So long, have a good day. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.